wanted to talk about in this book is that trade-off, that there is no right or wrong answer as far as I'm concerned, and so I really wanted to describe all sides. There are just two, but all sides of the impacts, but also the benefits that were achieved from it. I think it's a real testament to the industry that we have recognized that now and have put structures in place for making sure that we're lessening the negative impacts.
Welcome back to DAM, the official podcast of Northwest Hydropower. I'm your host, Austin Rohr, and I manage all things communications here at Northwest River Partners. I know regular listeners have heard me say this before, and I apologize that you're going to hear me say it again in just the first few seconds of this episode. But DAM is all about telling the untold stories of hydropower. Today we're going to talk about a completely different type of story and a different type of storytelling. More specifically, a historical fiction novel. The Grand Promise takes readers back to the 1930s Public Works program. An eastern Washington town is uprooted, and a family grapples with personal and financial dilemmas. A father resists inevitable change and enters into a fierce conflict with his son. The historic construction of Grand Coulee Dam, a massive project destined to bring prosperity to the Pacific Northwest, will also destroy the family's home and their town. But it will change the lives of their community and the lives of indigenous people who have sustained themselves on the Columbia River for generations. Joining me in studio on this episode is none other than the author of The Grand Promise herself, Rebekah Anderson. And I'm really thrilled that we're able to make this happen and have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you're not just an author. You're also the senior manager of communications and marketing at Tacoma Public Utilities. Could you maybe tell us a bit about that role and how you ended up there?
Sure. I actually come from a family of utility workers. I'm third generation. My grandfather started out as a meter reader for Washington Natural Gas back in the 1920s. And so I've known the industry for a long time. And I actually started in utilities at Puget Sound Energy in the communications department there, and then was recruited over to Tacoma Public Utilities. So I do a lot of talking about utility business to our customers and to the larger community, to the communities around our dams as well. It's part of our function. So I've been doing this work for about 15 years now, and I really enjoy giving back to the community, and it's always fascinating. There's always something really interesting going on, and I think that the average customer sort of takes the power for granted until the lights are out, and so the goal for us is to really be able to connect with them and have that personal touch of helping them understand the impacts of what the utility decisions are to their lives.
With that background of having multiple generations of people in utilities, was it ever kind of a question of what you want to do, or were you pretty dead set that you wanted to continue that path?
Honestly, I had no intention of going into utility work, but I have found that I really, really enjoy it. I can't imagine doing something else.
Yeah, it's a great industry to be in, speaking as someone who's in it myself. Going way back to episode 8 of this podcast, we had Ted Case on to talk about some of his books. And one of the things he mentioned was this strategy of writing every day 10 minutes, regardless of whether it was on a book or not on a book, just always putting 10 minutes aside to write. How did the writing process look like for you? I mean, was there a strategy you implemented to make time from your job to be able to write this book?
Yeah, the strategy is to write really early in the morning before everybody else is up and emailing and the distractions of the day start. So that's the way that I have operated with writing. It did take me a long time to write this book in fits and starts. I wrote a full draft and then put it down and needed a break and then picked it back up. And actually substantially rewrote it about 5 years into it based on some feedback that I got from readers. But that has been the way I've made it work, is to write, or to get up early and write in the morning before the day has, the chaos has begun. And then I would not have finished this manuscript without COVID. Not being out and about, not having a commute, afforded me so much more personal time in my day to be able to finish writing it and secure a publisher.
I think that there were a lot of silver linings to the pandemic, as much as there was plenty of terrible things. It's always nice to hear that there's sort of good things that could come out of that time period as well. As far as the inspiration for the book, especially given the amount of time that you devoted and the years that it took to actually produce it, what was it that drove you to put this together and to write a story about Grand Coulee, the construction of the dam, and the lives that were impacted?
It's loosely based on family history. My grandfather, who I mentioned, who was a meter reader for Washington Natural Gas, his father actually homesteaded in that area, so my great-grandfather, in a town called Bossburg, which is just south of the Canadian border on the Columbia River. So 100-ish miles upstream from where the Grand Coulee Dam was eventually built. They lived there long before the construction started, and they actually moved away before the dam was built. But I was out there on a road trip with my mom one summer, and she wanted to go see the family homestead where her dad was born. And so we went and drove out there, and then she wanted to see what might be left of the town, which I just assumed that she meant because it was very old and dilapidated at this point. But when we got to where the town site was, she explained that most of the town was now under Lake Roosevelt, which was created when when Grand Coulee Dam was built. That's the reservoir that's backed up behind the dam. And I had never heard this history before, that a whole town would be, gone because of the dam being built. And I was really fascinated by this. And as we were driving around the area and visiting different historical societies and interpretive centers on our trip, I was reading books about the history of the area. And just like you were saying, the untold stories, that is exactly what this felt like to me. It had been 80 years or so since the dam was built, and so there weren't a lot of people with living memory of what that time was like. And it just seemed like a story that needed to be told to contemporary readers who probably, like me, didn't know anything about this history. And not just the history of the Grand Coulee Dam, but there was a lot of proliferation of dams during that era in the 1930s, public work projects that were funded by the federal government to help bring the economy out of the Great Depression.
There is certainly an untold history there, I think. I wasn't aware of this either, prior to the book and everything like that. And, you really hear about sort of what the dam produced, what the aftermath of building it was. But there isn't really a lot that captures the sort of, immediate before and the during process as much. It's very, it's celebrated as a big success of public works, but yeah, you don't really hear the stories of the communities and things like that. When it came to studying the history, what did that look like for you in terms of kind of getting that backstory? Obviously some of it comes from personal family experience, but was it easy to find stuff out there, or did you really have to dig to maybe find some of these stories to put together your own?
My best resource for the personal stories were publications by local historical societies, so county historical societies, city historical societies. And they had a lot of newspaper articles that talked about, individual people in the town, not specific to the impacts of the dam, but just like what life was like and kind of like some color of local characters that I found really useful in writing about the townspeople. There are historical nonfiction books about the construction of the Grand Coulee Dam. There's a great one called Harnessing the Dream by actually a writer who's based in Oregon, whose name is Paul Pitzer. And I think of it as like the seminal history book about the Grand Coulee Dam. And he's writing from like the teens when this discussions about irrigation first started in the Columbia Basin, all the way into the extensions that they put on the dam in the 50s and 60s. And so that was really helpful for like the factual information that I needed to keep the story credible. But it was really those personal anecdotal stories of the town's folks that helped me build the texture of the story.
And so in that, I assume, this is maybe as well where some of the ideas for the characters came from as well then.
Mm-hmm. Some of them were, the two main characters, father and son, are based on my great-grandfather and my grandfather. Loosely. I never met my great-grandfather. He passed before I was born, but he's sort of legendary in our family. And he really did operate a ferry business in real life, just like he does in the book. And he actually, my great-grandfather's name was Oscar Botts, and he made like a footnote mention in a state history book about Washington State ferries, because apparently one of his customers tried to pay him with a very large bill, and so he had to make change. It would be like if you gave somebody a $100 bill for a 50-cent item. And so he had to make change for this, and he was not happy about it and punched him. And so he's mentioned in the Washington State ferry history book for this incident. But he was sort of known for being a little bit of a hothead and a kind of a colorful character in town, and was kind of mischievous. So I wove that characterization into the story. And then some of the other characters are based on historical figures. Franklin Roosevelt makes an appearance in the book, and it was actually really fun writing the scenes with him. I kind of gave myself a writer's exercise for this. And his speeches are public domain. And so I worked with resources from his presidential library, the Roosevelt Presidential Library, and then also a presidential library at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and was able to get verbatim copies of the speeches that he made at the construction site of the Grand Coulee Dam. And I borrowed what he said. So anything that Roosevelt says in the book is something that he actually said in one of his speeches at the dam when he visited. He visited the location twice.
That's always a very interesting thing when you start getting into historical fiction books, is kind of finding that balance between the actual history and the events that took place, and then obviously, a lot of times when you're trying to tell fiction, like, you have to weave the narrative and the story together, using a lot of things that wouldn't necessarily be one-to-one or perfect history, right? How do you kind of strike that balance for yourself and find something that worked for you in terms of weaving those two together?
There seems to be two camps of historical fiction writers. One side is really dedicated to the facts, and they see the story as like supporting the facts. It's a way of personalizing the facts. And then there's the other camp, which I fall in, which is that it's primarily a story. It's meant to be an experience of what it was like to be a person in whatever the circumstance was, but it's based on real events. So my approach is to do enough research to be able to be credible, and to make it factually accurate enough to feel plausible and authentic, but that you can play a little bit with the facts to serve the narrative. So I'll give you an example. The actual construction of the dam took 10 years, but I have a character in the book who is 16 when the story starts and like 20 when the story ends, and the dates weren't working, so that it was too long of a stretch of time for her character arc. And so I compressed the timeline of the construction of the dam. Not one person has ever noticed that. I talk about it because I get asked this question, and this is an example of how I manipulated some of the details, but it doesn't change the plausibility of the story, even though that part is factually inaccurate. I also changed the name of the town that they live in. In real life, it's Kettle Falls, and I changed it to Kettle Rapids, kind of so that I could play with facts a little bit without, causing any concern with the community that I wasn't accurately portraying their history.
Yeah, that 100% makes sense, and I think it kind of leads to another question for me, which is, and we'll get into a lot more kind of that content side of the book and everything, but what's the value for you in trying to make sure that when you're doing that sort of storytelling that I guess the focus would be more at that point to make sure the message of the book and kind of the themes and ideas are there, as opposed to just getting, all the details straight. And I suppose I'm kind of curious, like from an author's perspective, the value in making sure that those themes are present and there and, can work in this story so that people kind of get the takeaway that you're trying to make sure they get.
I really wanted to get at the larger truth of the story versus like the factual truth of the story, although the factual truth needs to be there and be represented. What I learned in researching this story is that there was really no right or wrong party, and that was fascinating to me, and also because I work in this industry and my family has worked in this industry. We see this all the time, right? That there isn't this like big bad brother out there. That there are benefits and consequences to all of these things, and it's still playing out today in hydro. It's still playing out today in development of housing. That environmental and cultural impacts are going to happen, but also we need more housing and we need electricity. We're relying on electricity now. And so there's a trade-off there. And so what I really wanted to talk about in this book is that trade-off, that there is no right or wrong answer from as far as I'm concerned. And so I really wanted to describe all sides. There are just two, but all sides of the impacts, but also the benefits that were achieved from it.
It definitely stands out to me as something that's present in this book, is capturing the human experience of going through something like this, and not just the actual experience of maybe going to work every day and helping pour the concrete, but the experience of the town, of the relationships, of the way that people are living with and grappling with such a massive change taking place.
Yeah, it was really important to me to capture that and personalize it. So I guess that's partly because I'm a fiction writer. I was writing fiction before I started working on this book, and so that's kind of how I process things. And so that was the format that I felt most comfortable describing what I was also learning for myself at the same time as I was working on the book. But yeah, it was really important to me to tell the human impact side of that story, and that's what really makes it fiction to me, is that it's got that emotional quality to it that you don't necessarily get when you're just reading nonfiction history book.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's something that I think is definitely valuable when we're having these kinds of discussions, even today, right, is trying to consider some of these things that maybe get lost in the conversation and the discussion around, just the pros and cons on a sheet of paper.
Right. And there's a real human impact that it can be positive or negative from the same decisions that are made.
Right. When you were doing the research for this, was there anything that stood out to you in particular that you kind of learned along the way, or perhaps something that as you were putting this book together really surprised you at all?
I think what I wasn't anticipating was that there just were not the same expectations back then for environmental and cultural mitigation the way that we have now. It just was not part of the conversation, and so there was no fish passage built at the Grand Coulee Dam, and I think they've tried some methods like shipping fish out, but 1 million salmon were estimated to be caught upstream from the Grand Coulee Dam every year by the Native American communities in the area. So that entire source of food and economic benefit was completely lost for tribes from all over that part of the state. And I don't think I didn't really know the extent of the impacts that had. And also there was a lot of debate about how the valuation of property was reached. It seems that there was not really any consistency in what people were offered for their homes. And many of them felt undercut by the amount of money that they were offered to, basically lose their home, potentially their livelihood. The characters in my book operate a ferry on the river, so their family business is going to be lost to the reservoir, as well as their homes. And so it's huge economic impact for them as well.
It's really interesting, as you're describing this to me, the thing that stands out in my head is this conversation that I had on this podcast with a guest, Blaine Meek from Agri Northwest, who was really describing the challenges with, say, what dam removal might look like today in terms of, what happens to the irrigation, and the idea that, if you're growing an annual crop, you might be able to recover faster. But if you're talking about, let's say, an apple orchard or a vineyard or something of that nature, that those take years to grow and develop, and once you pause irrigating them for a period of time and they die, it takes, perhaps a decade or more to get them back to a point where those would then be viable producing farms again, which is a huge impact. But thinking about, possibly property owners or landowners at this point in time, when you're talking about the 1930s and the Depression, the resources to potentially restart your livelihood somewhere else or in some way else, it's probably pretty daunting, I would think.
Yeah, well, especially the way that the economy was at that time. But that said, so we were just talking about the impacts to the individual family that I would characterize in the book and the Native American communities in the area. But the flip side of this is that 6,000 jobs were created at the dam itself. So there was work suddenly available in the area that wasn't there before. And also small businesses. The whole community of small businesses cropped up around the dam to serve the workers, restaurants, bars, movie theaters, grocery stores, brothels. There was a lot of vice in the area. So that's the other side of that this whole economy sprouted up around the construction of the dam that helped bring the area out of the Depression. Also, once it was completed, it was primarily, the original intent was irrigation, and it provided irrigation water to thousands of acres in the area that were formerly unfarmable. And then also their plan was that the power sales would eventually pay back the construction of the dam. But now, there's so much more demand for electricity that it very quickly, the power sales very quickly exceeded the irrigation benefits of the project. But that's kind of what I was trying to get at with the story generally, is that there were all these other benefits that were created as well, which, to your point, would be really hard to unwind at this time.
Certainly, and that kind of leads me to a question I wanted to ask you, which is how your perspective on hydropower has changed, or if it has changed since writing this book.
I think I understand it better. More that I understand the history of how it came about, and I actually have more of an appreciation for all of the work that is done now to mitigate environmental impacts, offset land that is now under lakes, with wildlife habitat. There's so much more work that goes towards closing that gap or minimizing the negative impacts of hydro that just didn't exist back then. And I think it's a real testament to the industry that we have recognized that now, and over the decades since the Grand Coulee Dam was built, have put structures in place for making sure that we're lessening the negative impacts of hydro.
It's reminding me a lot of a book that I read, it must have been 2 years ago now, which feels like it's flown by, but I think it was 2 years ago now. But it was a really interesting book, actually totally nonfiction. It was sort of a personal story of a guy who was a fire lookout in, I think, New Mexico, in a national forest there. But one of the really interesting things is that, kind of as he's telling his own story of living this very isolated life in a fire lookout for a summer at a time, he's also talking about the way that the federal government changed their perspective on fire management, and the ways that, similar to what you're talking about with Grand Coulee, with sort of the environmental impacts and the mitigation for the dam, that those perspectives really changed. Although it sounds like in maybe the fire management case, it was like a real fight to get there. There was a lot of pushback and a lot of people that kind of, didn't want to change the way that we were thinking about our resources. And I think to your point, that's something that, at least from where I sit today, and not maybe having as much of the historical understanding of things, it seems like the hydropower industry has done a good job of not fighting to make those changes and rather embracing them and being willing to make that happen along the way and be adaptive.
Yeah, I would agree. I think some of it is probably regulated as well or required as well. But I certainly don't see that same, I have not observed that resistance, at least in my lifetime. Maybe previous in the decades in between there maybe was more, but I would agree.
When it comes to telling a story like this, being people in public power and communicating in public power, it would be very easy to be extremely biased towards hydro and just to say everything's great about it. How important was it to tell a story that would display both the positives and negatives of constructing Grand Coulee Dam?
It was very important to me. It was really my main objective was to let the reader decide, and try to fairly portray the impacts to the various different groups of people who were affected by this, but also talk about the benefits that were realized out of it, and do it in a personal way so that the reader can walk away and I would assume come to the same conclusion I did, which is that there really is no right or wrong side of the conversation, that there are going to be pros and cons to any kind of massive project like this.
Well, that is something that, without giving too many spoilers or details away about the story itself, this book does raise a really important question, which is whether or not the construction of Grand Coulee was ultimately justified, at least in the eyes of those living through the change at that time. But looking at where we are at today, do you think that there is more of a clear-cut answer as to whether or not it's justifiable?
Well, it's here. It's not going anywhere. It is still the largest hydro generator in the United States, produces 21 billion kilowatt hours of electricity every year. We rely on it to have inexpensive, clean power. I think that it took a long time for reparations with the tribes to be made, and that is unfortunate, but at least there has been some closing of the gap there. The original promise was that they would receive a portion of the electricity sales. The dam went into operation in 1941, and they did not receive any payments until like the 1990s. So 50 years that they were not compensated for power sales. So there were things like that I think could have been really easily prevented, but I don't think that those are necessarily, that's not the dam's fault, right? That was a human fault, right? So I think I feel the same as I've always felt, is that like I said, there are going to be costs associated with something this massive. That's a big change, but also it is a huge resource for our region as well.
And when we look kind of to where we're at today, do you think it's something that where we could, see potentially the inverse costs if we were ever to try and sort of undo the construction of Grand Coulee?
It's going to be really interesting to see how this all plays out regionally, because right now we don't have something to replace it at that scale. Could that happen in the future? In the near future? Possibly. Some kind of game-changing technology could come on the scene that could replace hydro and be better than hydro. It just kind of remains to be seen. I am very curious to see the direction that this conversation goes over the next probably 20 years.
Without giving up too much here, do you have other plans to continue this story or to continue with other ideas for other books maybe?
Well, the next thing that I want to do is adapt it into a radio play. It fits for me the era, and I want to write the adaptation so that it's like a dramatized audio play and then release it like a limited series podcast. Maybe you can help me, give me some advice on podcast production.
Definitely. We could probably exchange some notes on book writing and podcasting and all that. And it is, just by the way, currently a physical copy, right? There isn't like an audiobook component.
Not yet. I'm planning to release a Kindle and audiobook this year, and then start working on the audio play version of it. Just depends on how long it takes me to write that, the script for that. But I wanted to also just mention the cover, since your listeners can't see it. It is inspired by national park posters. Mm-hmm. And even this, I was really fortunate to be able to participate in the cover development. A lot of authors don't have they just sort of have veto power over what the publisher puts together. But this is actually a photograph that I took at the original site of Kettle Falls, which is now under Lake Roosevelt, which is, you can see here in the background. And then I worked with an illustrator to take that photograph and turn it into this illustrated look. And then a graphic designer found this font called NPS 1935, which I'm assuming stands for National Park Service 1935. Mm-hmm. So she found this historic font, and then we used that for the titling on it. And the intention was to have it look similar to national park posters of the 1930s.
Yeah, it totally fits that, especially having people also can't see here, but we have a basically a national park poster print in the office here of Bonneville Dam, and it looks like right on point with that. So that is really cool and really interesting to hear kind of the story of how you were able to develop that photo into something like that.
It was a lot of fun. And the other fun thing about it was that, writing is very solitary. And so I had spent, and it was COVID when I finished the writing the final edits for my editor at my publishing house. And so I had been really isolated for a long time, like just trying to get this done, and plus all of the restrictions around the pandemic. And then so the last thing I got to work on before it was published was this collaboration with other creative people to develop the cover art, and that was like this sort of relief to finish with like other humans.
Yeah, that I imagine that was probably pretty helpful for you. With the cover, one of the things that's very interesting about it is that I think when maybe people visualize Eastern Washington, they visualize the area around Grand Coulee. They don't think of something as maybe forested or whatever, but both with the cover and then certain kind of details within the story. There's different mentions of the woods in that kind of northern region. Going to that a little bit. I mean, how important was it for you to kind of paint the picture, set the scene for people so that they understood not only the characters, the kind of overarching story of the dam, but also really the way that area looked during that time period?
Well, the landscape is pretty critical to the historic story, not just to my story. It changes a little bit when you're north up by Bossburg and Kettle Falls area. It's a lot more forested along the river there, a lot of ponderosa in the area. And then it changes as you get closer to where Grand Coulee is, further south. It gets a lot more arid, and that's where there are several coulees all through there. And the place that they chose to build the dam was actually like kind of a natural spot where an ice dam was during the Ice Age. And so it already had sort of that dam shape to be able to construct there, but the rock on the surface was very loose, and so they had to chip all of that away to get to bedrock to be able to pour concrete on it. So one of the first things that they have to do for construction is like chipping away all of that. They called it overburden. Mm-hmm. Chip all of that loose rock out of that ice dam to be able to pour concrete and have it, not come loose from the rocks.
It is kind of amazing to think that concrete can actually like stay there on its own,
Yeah.
Something else that comes to mind for me is that, in some ways, even just describing the challenges and the changes that are taking place for the different characters throughout the story. Something that, might almost mirror that today is like the concept of gentrification, essentially. And this idea again of, things are changing rapidly. A lot of economic development is happening. There's a lot of positive and benefits and things that are being brought in that come with that, but then also, there is the impact to the people that are living a certain way at that point in time that maybe don't want to see those changes taking place. Do you think that maybe some of those ideas or elements were, crucial to writing this story and kind of helping a modern audience relate to people going through an experience like that in the 1930s? Absolutely.
And there's still the ongoing debate about, is progress good, or what is progress? Is developing a huge apartment complex in a diverse neighborhood a good thing or a bad thing? Is it displacing people? Is it providing housing? These are questions that we're asking all the time now around development projects or changes that are taking place in our communities. And I absolutely intentionally wanted to make that connection, that we're still asking this question, not just about hydro projects, but about all kinds of projects that are changing the face of how we live.
When I read the book, the thing that, was one of my key takeaways was sort of along those lines of not having as much of a clear, defined way of saying, well, this is when it's good or this is when it's bad, but more kind of further opening up my own thoughts about maybe, where some of those questions are and how to kind of wrap your head around and grapple with some of those different challenges. Is that something that you wanted readers to take away, was to sort of ask questions in their own minds about these things?
Yes, for sure. And I think, the point is that it's complicated, that there isn't really one right answer. There are things that we give up and things we gain in all of these situations that we're talking about. And so I guess for me personally, what that means is that there's no villain, because there isn't really a right or wrong side. It just is complex, and we're giving things up as we gain things. And it's sort of this pragmatic, realist perspective, I guess, that there is no villain of the story. And I really tried to embody that with the character of Starks, who is leading, he's the head of the construction company. It would be very easy to make him a villain, right? But he's not. He's providing jobs for thousands of people, bringing irrigation to the area. He's a self-made man and a war veteran. And it would have been an easy cheat to just make him like a bad person who's, enacting this on the local area. But he's not. He's a rounded character who's giving people jobs and interacting with he sort of takes the main character, Carter, under his wing a little bit. But he sort of embodies that notion of like, there's no villain, there are multiple perspectives on how these projects play out and what the pros and cons are that we have to just accept.
Were there other characters, kind of mentioning some of those ones, were there some other characters in there that, as you were kind of writing them and everything, you felt maybe particularly like an attachment to in some kind of way, where just something about their arc, or maybe the different kind of traits or anything were just kind of particularly fun or interesting to you in some way?
Yeah, my favorite character is Charlotte Powell. She's an orchardist who is a widow, and she kind of starts out as a minor character and ends up becoming pretty important to the story in the end. She came out of nowhere. She's not really based on anyone, other than I was reading about the sort of history of apple growing in that area, and I thought that was would be an interesting addition to sort of the pantheon of people who are characterized. But she was just a lot of fun. She kind of showed up with a feisty voice, and she's an independent woman. She's not looking for a husband. She's running her own business, which she's kind of counter to, I think, what you would expect of that time period. And so she was a lot of fun because she sort of shows up with she's got a funny voice and a way of looking at things. But then becomes like more and more important to the outcome of what happens to the town.
I had a writing professor once, actually a professor of a few different things. I took a few different classes with them, but one of the things that they conveyed to me many, many times through many classes was that you could only write what you know. And that's particularly true when you're talking about writing for media or for journalism or communications. But when it comes to something like this, aside from the historical aspect that we've kind of touched on and some of the research that influenced things, were there other kind of elements of the story or themes for certain characters that came from other experiences or other sort of thoughts or insights that you had that you were able to include in this story?
Well, one thing that really sticks out to me when you say that is when you're writing people's interiors, like their thoughts and motives and history and kind of their emotional landscape, I don't have insight into any other person's interiors, so that's all you have to pull all of that from yourself. So kind of like the emotional landscape of every character is really something that's kind of based on me. I can describe people, and but like to your point about writing what you know, I really had to pull that from myself, and like how would I feel about this, how would I react to this, and then dramatize that in the book. But yeah, that was an interesting process.
Yeah, I can imagine kind of trying to maybe piece out certain elements of certain kind of sides of yourself to maybe emphasize something for one versus make sure like, well, we don't want this, we kind of need this person to fit into this role, so they can't really go here, even though this is maybe where I would typically want to go. I'm sure that's a challenge balancing that.
Yeah. It was also really fun writing FDR. I had a really good time dramatizing that. And it's funny because I write content as part of my day job, and I was reading the speeches that someone must have, I don't know if he wrote his own speeches or not, but the rhetoric was very different in that time. Like it just was, it was a little over the top. And that we wouldn't right. we wouldn't write a speech for someone like this today. So that was it was a challenge to work that into the tone of the rest of the writing.
Yeah, that without going down too much of a tangent, it's something interesting that I saw a long time ago. I think it's probably been almost 10 years since I saw this sort of idea in an article or something, but they were essentially describing how the reading level of presidential speeches over time, as you go through and measure, has dropped substantially. And so I'm kind of laughing just thinking about, how that might influence your writing when all of a sudden, there's these very, like you said, the rhetoric is different, the language is a bit more floral perhaps.
Yeah.
And then, you try and transition into something like being a communicator at a public utility where you really don't want any of those
right.
any of those traits.
Yeah, it was. I was fascinated reading through the speeches for exactly that reason. I was like, wow, this just sounds completely different from the way that we talk today.
And it's crazy how fast that change has taken place. This is a story from less than 100 years ago, right? So, we've certainly changed the way we communicate quite a bit in a very short period of time.
Yeah, it's really true.
When it comes to the book and sort of how it's been received, as you kind of touched on that a little bit, I mean, what has some of the feedback been, and kind of where has your story been able to spread to?
It's been really fun hearing from people who live in that area and how excited they are that someone is paying attention to and kind of giving voice to that history. I did an event at a library in Waterville, Washington, which is like halfway in between Wenatchee and Dry Falls area, so kind of up in north central part of Washington. And it's a town of 1,100, and like 25 people showed up to this event at the library to hear me read and talk about the history of the book. And this gentleman approached me and said, I'm 95 years old, and I remember, he was a kid, so he would have been 5, I guess. I remember when the dam was being built, and of course I didn't work on it, but I remember that time. And he had a pamphlet from 1937 that he showed me and asked me if I would trade him for a signed copy of the book. I was like, of course. So that's been really fun, hearing from people from the area who really, feel a strong sense of ownership of this history and excitement that someone is giving it attention. And then other people who are really surprised by, that this history is even out there, who didn't know anything about it. And most people who I run into regionally have some kind of connection to the Grand Coulee Dam. They've been there before, or there's some personal connection to it. So that part has been really fun.
Yeah, that it's really interesting to think that we are sort of approaching the point where there aren't going to be any people left to have firsthand experiences with that period of time in our history. And I'm sure that, given the timing of this, it's probably a pretty incredible experience to be able to connect with some of those people, even if maybe they are second generation, right, and their parents were the ones who lived through it. But being able to connect with people that, lived through an event that I think, in modern times, it's almost hard to wrap your head around anything like this taking place.
Yeah, and a lot of people who say, like, oh, my grandfather worked on that, or oh, my uncle. There were a lot of people who went out to the site. I don't know if you are familiar with The Boys in the Boat book about the University of Washington rowing crew, and then there's George Clooney just made a movie about it. But they left this out of the movie, but in the book, 3 of the crew members actually go out to Grand Coulee Dam during the summer on break from school because they need work, and people were flooding the area from all over the state for jobs, and so there, it didn't just have impacts to people who lived in the immediate area. There were people from all over Washington State and beyond who were temporarily relocating there for work.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and like you said, I mean, 6,000 jobs was no small amount. Do you know, I mean, I'm just kind of curious, and you might not know the answer off the top of your head, how large was the population there prior to bringing all these people in to work on the dam?
Oh, really small. And so there was this whole area that built up. I was talking about like the services that built up. Once the construction was complete, that pretty much vanished. There was no one left. Like a lot of the workers left. And even when you go back there now, there's a small community that was actually built to house the Bureau of Reclamation workers. They call it Engineers Town. That's still there, but the whole town, there was a shack town across the river that was all just temporary housing for construction workers. It's completely gone. That doesn't exist anymore. There's some more permanent housing also on that side of the river that were for the construction company workers that's still around, but all of that was built for the construction. There wasn't a lot there before.
Yeah, that kind of makes a lot of sense to me. I haven't been out there too many times, but the time that I did go out there, I remember thinking, that for such a large hydroelectric project, there isn't a tremendous community around this, certainly. I think I can't remember the town off the top of my head. There is a town right there, but and Banks Lake isn't far away. That's where we were out camping at the time. But it's very interesting just to realize that all this stuff kind of happened, and it was this flash of came in, it went out. It's really interesting and really great that there's a story like yours to not only capture just sort of the facts, but again, get back to that human side of it, of trying to put you in the shoes of someone that would have been living through that. Because again, I just don't think people today can possibly imagine anything like that taking place. I mean, infrastructure projects of that size and scale, especially given the amount of regulation and policy that's in place, they just don't happen that in a 10-year time span like that.
Yeah, it was an unusual time.
So kind of as we're wrapping up here and getting towards the end of the conversation, are there things that you would like people who are planning to read this book or have read this book and are listening to this podcast today, the things that you would really like them to know, kind of maybe overarching takeaways, not even necessarily pertinent to the details of the story, but just things that you would like them to maybe be considering when they read or considering after they read?
Yeah, I think we've been talking about it a lot. It's this notion that these types of projects are complex, and there are going to be impacts, but also benefits, and that this was a really unique period in our history that is pretty much out of living memory at this point, and but is also still really relevant in conversation today, and it's been really helpful to me to look back and see the reasons that went into these construction projects that maybe are not top of mind today when we're talking about hydro, and why there was a proliferation of dam construction in that time period.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that. I think it's definitely an important thing for people to consider. And there's definitely something to be said for, the the experience of rural electrification and not just sort of the textbook telling of it. I guess, the last kind of, big question I'll hit you with is, where can people buy your book? Where can people go to read it and to get their hands on it?
Well, again, the title is The Grand Promise, and you can reach out to your local library or bookstore and request it if they don't already carry it, and you can always order it on Amazon and other online retailers.
Perfect. Another question for you, a bonus. It's not really a bonus question because it's a common question we do, but I guess I'll start with this. Have you listened to any episodes of the podcast before?
I have heard you record episodes of the podcast before. I think it was at the Nick that you were recording.
I actually didn't get to participate in that one. I was super bummed to miss it.
Okay. So I've actually heard the podcast recorded live.
Okay. So one thing we like to do at the end of every podcast is we ask our guests a question so that we can try to give our audience the ability to get to know the person behind the microphone a little bit better, and make sure that we're always kind of I guess especially in the theme of today's conversation, getting back to that human connection and making it so that people can really relate to one another. So many times this industry and public power and hydropower seems like this kind of big, maybe intimidating thing to the rest of the world, but we're all just humans at the end of the day. And so the way that I like to do that is I ask all of our guests kind of on the spot to give us a little bit of life advice, and just something that they find important to them, something they live by, or maybe something that recently has stuck out to them, And I think, if you want to, as part of today's conversation, maybe that advice could tie into something about your experience writing the book, but it doesn't have to at all. It can also just come from anywhere at all and something that's meaningful to you. So with that, I'll open the floor up to you.
No pressure. I would say to remember to appreciate the good things. And I know that kind of sounds like a platitude, but I know me personally, I can get so focused on getting things done and kind of the next thing, and it really helps me to take a breath and remember to be grateful for the things that are coming along. Like, I have been out there schlepping this book for however long now, and I can get very focused on, like, okay, I need to line this up and follow up with this person, and needing to take a minute to be like, you know what? I finished my book and got it published, and people are enjoying it, and it's creating conversation, and I'm getting to talk to people about it, and that's really cool. I feel really good about that. And I think that my personality in particular, I have to remember to do that, or I will just kind of keep on that hamster wheel forever and not pause to take a moment to be grateful for the great hamster wheel that I have.
I think that a lot of people out there can certainly connect to that one. It's way too easy to get caught up in the momentum and not always slow down and take the time to have some gratitude for all the great things that we have in life. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us today, and also really appreciate you being here and making time for this. It's been so much fun to learn more about this book, and it's always so amazing when people in public power are able to do things like this, and to connect in ways beyond just sending out newsletters or putting together a social post or whatever. So really appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
We were long overdue for hosting Rebekah on DAM, and I'm personally really glad we finally made this happen. The Grand Promise fills such a unique niche, and I really hope you all will go out, pick up a copy for yourself, and get to reading. These are the sorts of perspectives, conversations, and stories around hydropower that can help us reach better informed and well-rounded thoughts about it. Downstream of those thoughts are the ideas, implementations, and policy changes that result in better outcomes for us all. Does that then suggest that something like the Grand Promise could be considered the headwaters of said stream? Or am I just getting too poetic here? I'll let you decide, and when you do, you can tell me what you think by heading to nwriverpartners.org. Doing so only requires that you fill out the contact form on our site, or just shoot me an email directly at info@nwriverpartners.org. Let me know what you think of the podcast, what recommendations you have for future episodes, and anything else on your mind. I also kindly ask that you share this podcast with your friends and family to help us grow our audience, and spread the good word of hydropower. Likewise, a 5-star review on your favorite listening platform is a huge help as well. And while you're there, don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes, which arrive every other Friday. Lastly, I always ask everyone to follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, X, YouTube, any other social media platform that we're on, and I think that's all of them. And you can do so by searching for NW River Partners. With that, I'm out of here, and you've got some reading to do now. So until next time, see ya.